Yesterday marked the end. Why are you laughing?
No, I'm laughing because I'm enjoying that about to record Joag kind of feeling. I love it.
Oh, okay.
I
Yeah,
get it
yeah.
every
Just
week, and it's you know
letting it wash over you.
yeah, it's beautiful.
I
And
like that it caused a little giddy giggle.
I often express my feelings with laughter.
It's true. You do
Yep.
that. All right. Well then,
Okay.
Mark.
Yes.
Yesterday marked the end of my birthday week. And we celebrated by driving down the shore to go see Further Seems Forever and the Juliana Theory in Asbury Park.
Okay.
Asbury Park is a really interesting place with some fascinating history to
These are
it.
you said these were emo bands, yes?
Yeah.
Because they got some emo ass names. Those
Oh,
are
yeah.
fucking emo as fuck
Right.
band names.
Big time. Anyone who was in the scene back then knows exactly who
Okay.
Juliana Theory and Further Seems Forever are. And it was a delight.
Good. Good.
But yeah, we went to Asbury. And I love Asbury Park. When Richard, our dear listener and friend
Yes. Yes.
Richard, came here and visited with his wife,
Mm.
took them to the beach there. It's what you think of when you think of like the beach boardwalks of the East Coast in
Sure.
like the early 20th century, the Coney Island stuff, all
Yep.
of
Yep.
that.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
That's what Asbury Park
Okay.
was and is. It was basically made as a copy of, Steeplechase Park and all that kind of stuff, as many places on the shore kind of were. And
Uh-huh.
it still retains a lot of that. And it's been through a lot over the years. For basically from like the 70s forward, it was almost like derelict for a
Mm.
while. It was, most things were shut down. There are two huge buildings. Well, there were three. One they did tear down, but there are two huge buildings left there. One that was a casino, one that was a convention hall.
Uh-huh.
And the convention hall is like very upgraded and all that kind of stuff now. I mean, it looks old and all that kind of stuff retains all of its old charm from the outside. It looks just like it did in the 1920s.
Beautiful. Oh,
Um,
that is nice.
yeah, the
Mm.
inside, however, like hosts huge concerts and stuff like that. Demi Lovato played there in August. There's cute little restaurants and shops, great
Mm.
little oyster bar there. And then the casino is like this busted ass, like old frame of a building. There's nothing left in it. There's murals on the inside and all of that.
Mm.
Unfortunately, it's super dangerous. So
Oh
they've
yeah.
like they just a few months ago closed it to the public. So you used to be able to like ride your bike through it, walk through, look at all that kind of stuff. But they're fixing it up, which is kind of a bummer. So yeah, it was like derelict for a while. It was,
Sounds like the kind of place that were in the UK, it would be a Weatherspoons by now.
you would be hard pressed to turn it into one. It's not really like
Oh,
it's not a
fucking
building.
Tim from
Um,
Weatherspoons could do it, mate.
yeah, maybe.
He could do it in like an
It's not
afternoon.
really a building. It's really like a frame.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and yeah, it's a cool spot. And it kind of started to make a comeback. And then Hurricane Sandy hit and did a lot of damage to like all of Jersey Shore. And Asbury actually made it out better than other places did and was able to reopen 2013. And
Good.
since then is almost too nice. Because the thing about Asbury Park is like it's a little creepy. Right? Like with that old broken down
I like that.
casino and
Yeah.
all that kind
Yeah.
of stuff, like it's got a spooky vibe to it that I've
Nice.
always
Uh-huh.
really loved. And one of its dark little features is right by that convention hall in the middle of the boardwalk, where there's a rock bearing a memorial to the SS Morro Castle. And while I've idly read that sign many times, I mean, I have tons of pictures of this sign and everything. For
Mm.
whatever reason, it never really struck me as like all that interesting until a wayward, weird New Jersey Instagram post alerted me to the fact that it's more than just a tragic shipwreck. It's also a murder mystery.
Ooh.
Yes.
I'm in.
The SS Morro Castle wrecked catastrophically off the shore of Asbury Park on September 8th, 1934.
This is like a military ship, yes?
Nope, it
Okay.
is not.
Okay. Okay.
I will get
I thought
there.
okay. I always understood SS. What does SS stand for?
uh some That's a good question. I know this and for some reason it isn't coming to my mind, but it does not mean anything military.
Fine, 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 fine. Thank you for putting me
Yeah.
straight on that.
Yeah. I was going to say sailing ship, but I don't think that's actually a thing.
Ah, I associate it with the Nazis, mate. That's why
Well,
I'm
I
thinking
had
of it.
that thought. I was like,
Yeah,
are you thinking that because of the Nazis? But that is an entirely different kind of SS
yeah, yeah, yeah.
than this. What does it stand for when it's boats?
I'm getting to that. For the Nazis, it's Schutzstaffel,
Sure.
the protection squadron. But anyway, we'll circle back. We'll pick that up.
Okay,
We'll
we'll
put it on the
circle back
replay.
to what SS
Yeah.
means. It wrecked on Asbury Park September 8th, 1934, while thousands of horrified but fascinated onlookers watched from the
Mm.
beach near the convention
Ugh.
hall building. And the
Unable to do anything
circumstances,
about it, unable to help, just
right,
watching on.
yeah, just
Yeah,
kind
yeah, yeah.
of gathering.
Mm.
Um, and the
Rubbernecking.
circumstances, well, yes, and that definitely comes into play here.
Mm.
The circumstances of the tragic fire at the center of the ordeal that took 137 lives are super sus. At best, this is a story of fatal incompetence.
Mm.
At what worst, it's one of murder and sabotage.
Yo.
So the ship was built in 1929 at the tail end of the good old roaring 20s with all the luxuries expected at the time. And in fact, had been part of sort of a government program that gave money to these various ship lines in order to sort of restore old boats that weren't working well, old ships.
A
Obviously,
little bit of
boats and ships are different
foreshadowing
things.
here, dear listener. This is not the first. This is not the last time during tonight's Jack of all Graves where we will visit the year 1929.
Oh
I'm gonna tell you
ho.
that. Yeah, shit was going down in that
Excellent.
year. Yeah, go on.
Yeah.
Tell me. Sorry, I jumped
A
in.
lot of shit went down famously in
Yeah,
1929.
yeah.
So, this boat was made wonderfully appointed ship in 1929, and its route ran back and forth between Havana, Cuba, and New York City.
Mm.
And while Cuba was in a time of political upheaval, it was also well known as a swinging hotspot for Americans who wanted to indulge in a little debauchery,
Sure.
especially during Prohibition. In fact, maritime law made it so that a ship like the SS Morro Castle was one of the only places you could legally drink, making cruising an even more appealing pastime for involuntarily sober
That's
Americans.
fucking wild that you banned alcohol for a
I
bit.
know, right?
That
I
is
was
so
thinking
fucking
as I wrote
mad.
this, I was like, I haven't done a cold open just purely on prohibition, and I should.
Because I mean, I've often thought that if alcohol were discovered today, it would not be legal.
Oh, yeah, it would be banned immediately.
A zillion percent.
Yeah. Well, yeah, completely. But,
They're
there's a lot
banning.
of interesting stuff to that
They're
history.
about to ban nitrous oxide over here. They're about to ban fucking laughing gas over here because it
Well,
gets
yeah,
caned so much by the kids.
as I have pointed out several times, those canisters are absolutely everywhere
God
in
damn, yeah.
London.
You don't get the same problem over there with
No,
nitrous,
not
though.
at all. I have literally never seen a canister in America ever.
Ah, man.
First time I ever saw one
Mm.
was in London. And then I was like, Jesus Christ, these things are everywhere, even on the train.
Yeah, oh god, yeah. They are ubiquitous.
Yeah.
So yeah, they're gonna get banned, which seems, yeah, that's definitely the right move. That'll sort it out.
Yeah, I'm sure it's definitely not going to be a problem.
Criminalize it.
Like,
Yes, great idea.
they're going to start having to put like whipped cream up on like a locked shelf, like
Yeah.
Sudafed,
Yes.
But yeah, so it wasn't long though. Obviously, this ship being built in 1929 and actually commissioned in 1930, or like went out in 1930. The Great Depression hit. And this drastically reduced the number of people who could afford a swanky trip to Cuba aboard a luxury liner, even though it was a fairly affordable one considering. It was no Titanic.
Yeah.
As such, by 1934, the Morro Castle was largely making its voyages about half full of passengers. And while the ship also carried cargo and made most of its money by actually carrying mail, it wasn't bringing in enough income for the powers that be to pay it that much attention. Thus, it was just shipping around with some very clear design flaws and safety issues that should have been addressed.
I see.
Like the fact that the outside of the ship was regularly repainted to make it look fresh and new, but not carefully, which meant that while they had plenty of lifeboats per regulations put into place post Titanic, several of those lifeboats were straight up sealed into place with the paint.
Yo,
So they were completely
wait,
unusable.
that's
Yeah.
not cool.
No, not supposed to do
Painted
that.
them Glued
Yeah,
them to the hull with paint. Fucking atrocious.
exactly. Yeah.
You know,
They treated.
this
Go
isn't
ahead.
the last appalling safety oversight from 1929 that we're going to hear
Great.
about on this week's Jack Walker. Tell
It's
you that.
amazing that anyone survived that
Fuck was
period
going
in
on in
American
1929?
history.
Mm,
It was just, it was a rough go over here
mm,
for a hot
mm.
minute.
It's a great filter.
It, they treated the crew abysmally, which meant an incredibly high rate of turnover, which is not what you want when it comes to operating a highly specialized vessel carrying people across the ocean.
Sure.
Just a bunch of inexperienced dudes picking up odd jobs like, yeah, sure, I can probably boat. How hard could that be? Conditions were so bad. One crew member, George Alagna, attempted to rally the rest of the crew to strike for their rights, holding up the ship's departure for the voyage. Eventually, he was placated with a raise and better accommodations, but he had firmly placed himself on the officers' shit lists. This will come back around, so remember that. um, and I just want to say outright, there are a lot of different narratives of this story in which facts differ in small but significant ways, and it's super hard to parse which details are fully factual and what ones have been embellished or just distorted
Yeah.
in the
Apocrypha.
game of game of telephone that is history. So I'm going to do my best to differentiate what is known for sure
Okay.
and what is a little hazier, but there's simply no way to get every detail fully right because even the papers and newsreels of the time have like totally differing accounts. So you were going to say something.
No, why would that be?
I think because so many people died, for one. As we'll get into, evidence was destroyed because this ship was charred. Like there was everything was just more or less impossible to like go through and like find out what happened in any way because it was all burned to shit. So being so destroyed, there's really, and forensics
primary
being,
evidence was scarce.
Yes, exactly. Forensics being completely different at that point, yeah, there just wasn't much left to say for sure what happened here. So many people died. It's just, yeah, a lot of a lot of ways in which this stuff can get mixed up on top of like kind of the sensationalism of papers and newsreels at that time as well. Everything was, if you watch, there's I think I've linked to some of them in the blog, but if you even just go on YouTube and look up newsreels from this, like it's incredible to watch the way they tell these stories, and they're like so big and sound almost fictional the way that they talk about them. Just really sensational. So yeah, I think a lot of stuff just kind of gets caught up in the mythologizing of it at the time, the loss of evidence, all of that. And there's some things
I trust you to kind of give us the best.
I'm going to try to thread that needle.
Yeah. Okay.
And there's stuff like that has, like, even in the past decade, like more stuff has been found and things like that. People have found like footage in their attics and all kinds of stuff like that. Like, yeah, so we keep like honestly learning more and more about this even 90 years after it happened.
Nice.
So with that caveat in place, here's what happened. At around 2:50 a.m. on September 8th, 1934, a fire broke out in a locker of a writing closet on the SS Morro Castle. And a writing closet was where the passengers would just go to sit down and write letters.
Sit down, jot some shit down. Yeah. Dip a little pen in a little pot of ink. Yeah.
Sure. I'm sure some of them still enjoyed doing that. According to one source, another fire broke out elsewhere almost simultaneously. Not sure about that. But whether there was one or two fires, it all became one giant one, as the whole ship, which was decorated in ornate wood throughout and coated with an oil-based paint, burst into flames. The crew...
Up, isn't it?
What?
Wake the fuck up.
Yeah, exactly. Like just... Yeah. So this inexperienced crew, because the high turnover, had no clue what to do, being largely just unprepared for a situation like this, untrained. And this resulted in deadly hesitation. It took them too long to attempt to put out the fire. It took them too long to sound the alarms. A couple of the crew people actually going so far as to chastise two women who suggested it, saying that they'd wake the other passengers.
Oh my goodness.
which is exactly what the alarm is
Well, that's the
supposed to
fucking
do.
entire point. Would
Yeah,
you rather be awake or burn to death? You're
right.
dead.
Yeah. Um, they took too long calling for help. They didn't stop or turn the ship, which was caught in gale force winds, and that only helped the fire
Of
rip through it
course.
more efficiently.
Mm-hmm.
And when things started to get dire, these inexperienced crewmen on a cruise line that treated them like shit felt no obligation to give up their
Absolutely
lives
not.
to save
No, 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 no,
others.
no.
And they
No.
simply got the fuck out of there. The passengers had not been given any instructions for what to do in an emergency, and the crew was absolutely no help in guiding them. Now, they were supposed to have been given instructions, just like on modern cruises. If you go on a cruise now, they
Yeah,
will
yeah.
give you a safety thing beforehand,
Yeah.
tell you what to
Yeah.
do in case of emergency, how to use your
It's the
life
law.
jackets, blah, 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 blah.
Mm,
It's the law. Now, it was the law then as well. They did not do this.
I see.
So they lowered half full lifeboats, which, wouldn't necessarily have been the death knell, except that since the ship wasn't at capacity. But like I said, several of the lifeboats couldn't be lowered at all because they were painted into the boat.
Beautiful.
So now there weren't enough lifeboats for everyone. And the ones that had been launched were almost entirely full of crew. Only 85 people made it into lifeboats in total.
Of how many passengers?
In total, there was over 500. Yeah,
Oh, yikes.
85
Yeah,
on the
yeah.
lifeboats. And as people do when the smoke and fire begins to overcome them, they jumped.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, this worked out for some passengers who were then pulled ashore by onlookers if they made it that far, or pulled onto another ship that came to their aid. For others, this ended horribly. Some were chopped to bits by the ship's propellers.
Yikes. Gnarly.
Some, yeah, some
Yeah.
drowned, predictably. But perhaps the most awful thing of all was that some were severely injured or killed by their life vests. Apparently, the life jackets on the SS Morro Castle were made of cork. And what you're supposed to do is jump in holding the life jacket and then put it on once you're in the water. Now, the passengers did what any of us untrained would do, put it on and hopped over the side and snapped their necks instantly upon landing. Yep. Pretty terrible.
Oh man, that's made me
right.
Put my hand right in my mouth. Horrible.
Yeah,
that's a death
exactly.
vest, isn't it?
It's a death vest. Exactly. The lucky ones simply knocked themselves out and hopefully didn't drown. And a good chunk of those who didn't jump off simply died of smoke inhalation or worse, burned to death. And the ship was so hot everywhere that it was literally like you couldn't stand on the floor. It was just burning straight through like your feet and everything.
No way to go. That is no fucking way to go.
Yeah, there's really like every single possible way to die on this thing was awful. There's one story of like this is another one of those ones that's like, 60 years later, 70 years later, someone followed up and went to Cuba to tell these people how their like brother had died. Because, when they sort of got the news of it, their mother like shut down and like didn't even really tell them exactly what had happened. And this poor young boy who was like 12, I think, had like burns all over his body and then went into the salt water and was in that salt water for hours before he finally died. And there was a surviving crew member who had been 17 at the time who had been like talking to him through it and trying to sort of comfort him and take his mind off it and things like that. And he realized like the kid stopped talking, and that's when he realized that he'd finally died.
Sorry, this is
just it's awful.
This is fucking minging, mate.
I told you it's a lot. So yeah, awful ways to die happening here. And the ship eventually came to rest a smoldering charred husk on the beach at Asbury Park. And it became a tourist destination in and of itself. The beaches down the shore tend to essentially shut down after Labor Day as the tourist season slows and it becomes unprofitable to keep running a business. But people were coming in droves to see the wreckage of the SS Morro Castle, leading business owners to keep their doors open throughout the fall, selling souvenirs of it and all kinds of things. um, I want to say this is like different times, but I don't know that this
No,
wouldn't happen
no,
now.
certainly not.
Like, I don't know. I think they would try to make it like classy. Like they'd be like, "Oh, we're
Yeah,
memorializing
tea
it."
towels,
Right,
dinner plates.
in
Yeah,
memory of the
exactly,
victims,
exactly,
something
exactly,
like that. Yeah, a portion of the proceeds go to the families,
exactly.
something like that. Like we'd class it up, but we'd do
But
the
a
exact same
grift,
thing.
yeah, 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 by any
Yeah,
other name.
right. But again, it's the depression, and like these people are like, we will, we'll do what and sell whatever
Mm.
to make some money at this point. And so it ended up giving the area a much needed economic boost at times when Americans everywhere were barely scraping by. And the influx of people was so heavy, they had to change the flow of traffic on the main thoroughfares through Asbury into a sort of circular one way situation.
Because of all the
Uh,
death tourists.
right. Yeah. To
Mm.
accommodate all the death tourists, they had to change it. And it remained that way until the 2000s. So many people flocked there to see this
Oh, so the
death
wreck is
ship.
still in situ.
It's not, no, but
Okay, okay.
but it changed the traffic patterns for
Wow.
over
Yeah.
70 years, which is pretty wild. Dark tourism aside,
Yeah.
let's back up a little and talk about why all this is weird and potentially not just a tragic series of mishaps by the inept. So, on the evening of September 7th, 1934, a few hours before the conflagration, Captain Robert Wilmot was found dead. His onboard physician attributed it to acute indigestion, and later reports referred to it as a heart attack.
Okay.
What we know is that he had gone to his cabin to have dinner.
You don't
Uh,
die of indigestion. Sorry, I don't give a fuck if it's
right?
1929 or not.
Yeah. Like, medicine was barely a science at that point, but like,
Good
come
point.
on,
Yeah,
some
mate, you're
old
fooling
King
no
Cole
one.
shit.
Yeah.
Uh, and but he had gone to his cabin, he had dinner, he began complaining of stomach pain, and he died.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we know about this. Um, but it's hard to truly say what happened because sometime in all this chaos, Wilmot's body was lost. It was to be examined in New
Jeez.
York for poison or other such unnatural interventions,
Mm.
but simply could not be found, perhaps for no other reason than that had been more or less incinerated by the fire. We don't know. um, let's see. Per at least one report, a fire had also broken out earlier that day. Again, this is like, I don't know if this part is true, but the other part of what I'm about to say is so perhaps a fire had broken out earlier in that day, but had been extinguished without incident.
Mm.
Wilmot was reportedly shaken, though. He recognized the hallmarks of something intentionally incendiary, and he told his chief officer, William Worms, I'm afraid something is going to happen tonight. I can feel it. So we know he did say that. William Worms survived, and he said that much.
Okay. Yeah, he final destination did, didn't he? He saw it
Yeah,
all.
right.
He didn't, yeah. But not enough to get himself off the ship.
Right. He avoided death once, but not again. So he'd already had his suspicions up about George Alagna, the troublemaking radio operator who'd nearly shut down the ship with his strike antics. And he had the crew on high alert to make sure that he didn't try anything. But he also wasn't too keen on Alagna's mate in the radio room, George White Rogers. This was in part because he worked closely and seemed to be friends with Alagna. But according to an article in the magazine See Classics Now, Rogers had done some trickery in which he had fraudulently bluffed the former chief radio officer into resigning so that he could take his job.
I see.
This is another only appears in one account, so I can't necessarily verify it thing.
Yeah.
But in other accounts, it was referenced that the captain knew something that sort of got Rogers's, hackles up and meant that, something needed to be dealt with here. So what we do know is that the captain didn't like Rogers or Alagna, in part because of Rogers' association with Alagna, and that he had given Rogers a sort of stern talking to about their association before. So the captain dies, and his duties are handed down to the wildly unprepared chief officer, Worms, and all of this chaos ensues.
He certainly will shortly.
But
Hey.
nicely done. In the end, only 12 crew members who stayed on the ship survived. Among them, both Alagna and Rogers. And given the pot stirring Alagna had been involved in, he's pretty much immediately a suspect. While Rogers is hailed as a hero for having put out the distress call and saved lives. Alagna is cleared of wrongdoing and tries to go on living his life. The New York Times, in an article from March of 1935, 6 months after the disaster, though, said, quote, after writing 2 notes, one of which dealt with the Morro Castle disaster, in which 124 lives were lost last September 8th, George I. Alagna, 28 years old, first assistant wireless operator on the vessel, unsuccessfully attempted suicide by gas early yesterday morning, according to the police, in the apartment of friends at 3506 72nd Street, Jackson Heights, Queens.
Well, I first heard about this case 26 minutes ago, right? And it was Alagna. 100% it was him.
Well, I'm afraid you're wrong, Mark.
I'm not.
You're wrong. Alagna had clearly had deep trauma from this situation, and being accused of being responsible didn't help. Thus, suicide attempt. Geez, you dick. You're just like the rest of them.
Hey.
Meanwhile, George Rogers, the hero of the SS Morro Castle, had returned home to Bayonne, New Jersey, where he first opened a radio repair shop, which turned out to be unsuccessful and then burned down in what police suspected was arson, but couldn't prove. He was then recruited to the Bayonne Police Department as a radio operator, where the former seaman, who had been diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, got to talking.
I've always said that if you're involved in one giant fire with loads of fatalities, that's bad luck. But if you're involved in 2, then you're starting those fires. That's something I've always said.
Yeah, that's just, the wisdom.
Fires, yeah.
Right. It's like seeing 2 magpies. In a way. Unlike Alagna, who seemed to have struggled to come to terms with the event, Rogers loved to talk about the SS Morro Castle. And eventually, he talked way too much, explaining in detail to his lieutenant, Vincent Doyle, how someone could have theoretically started the fire on the ship. I mean, theoretically, in the O.J. Simpson, if I did it way. Like, clearly he did it.
Yeah.
And this became apparent to his lieutenant, who made the mistake of confronting him about it. Seeing the jig was up, Rogers had to act. So he brought a package to the lieutenant with a fish tank warmer that supposedly needed to be fixed, which Weird New Jersey insists was a perfectly normal thing for a police station radio operator to receive at the time, and I'll have to take their word for it. So when Doyle turned the warmer on, it immediately exploded, causing him severe injuries, including the loss of several fingers, but not killing him. Rogers was arrested and charged with attempted murder, sentenced to 12 to 20 years in Trenton State Prison, but paroled in 1945 to go fight the Jerrys or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
He was obviously rejected from serving because he, tried to kill someone, among other
He's
elements.
The guy you want on your team.
Right, yeah. Among other elements of his criminal past, which turned out to include robbery and more arson.
Oh, regular firebug, this guy.
Pretty much, yeah. But apparently good intentions counted, and they didn't send him back to prison. Instead, he went back to Bayonne and opened another unsuccessful radio shop, borrowing over $7,000 from a friend, William Hummel, to keep it afloat, which is a lot of money to lend someone now, let alone in 1952 when this happened. And in 1953, when Hummel decided to move to Florida, he approached Rogers and was like, okay, time to start paying that shit back, man, because I'm out of here. And given everything we know about Rogers, it will come as no shock to you that rather than rather than come up with a payment plan for his generous pal, once he felt the pressure, he decided to simply do away with the problem.
Fuck's sake.
Yeah.
This guy's a dickhead.
He's a giant dickhead. Yeah. Sounds awful. He went to Hummel's home and bludgeoned him to death along with his adult daughter.
Oh, mate.
Yeah, this just a fucking asshole.
Story has fucking me, man. This has taken me places.
I know. It's horrendous. I told you it was going to be a heavy hitter. It didn't take long for the cops to figure out it was this knucklehead, and he was arrested and convicted for the Hummel's murder in 1954, sentenced to life for the crime, which turned out to be only 4 years, as he died of a brain hemorrhage in 1958.
Good. I'm going to say good.
Yeah. Since he went in the way that scares me the most, I feel good about that. So we can't be entirely sure if 137 people died because George Rogers didn't want to be caught being shifty at work, seeing as all that evidence was left charred beyond recognition on the beach at Asbury Park. But a lifelong history of crime, a passion for making incendiary devices, and a hair trigger for retaliation make Rogers a fairly likely culprit in one of the worst maritime tragedies in American history.
Absolutely beautiful. How much of the story is on that plaque?
Not most of that. It merely says, like, that's the thing. That's why I never was like, okay, like it's just like a shipwreck. I mean, I like a shipwreck story or whatever, but it never seemed that interesting. It's just like the SS Morro, Morro Castle ran aground here. Onlookers watched. People died in a fire.
Way more to that tale.
Yeah, there's so much more to it than that. And it's horrible, but boat core.
And this podcast.
I mean, you signed up for this.
Yep. Go on, sorry.
You got anything? Late last night when we were all in bed, Mrs. O'Leary hung a lantern in the shed, but when the cow kicked it over, she winked her eye and said, it's going to be a hot time in the old town tonight. Fire, fire, fire.
What the fuck is that?
Not familiar? You don't know about Mrs. O'Leary and her shed?
Absolutely no fucking clue. But I liked it.
Good. It felt good to perform that for you.